Hilstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I had to move over here because now I'm on the committee and I get to ask questions. But Mr. Anfinson, this has been a slow creep of the court, and you've been talking about how this pilot project started off as civil and then has moved to criminal. So it's clear that that's the direction that the court is going to. And so while you may be specifically talking about the court rule as it is at this minute, that doesn't mean that there isn't a need for the state legislature to decide on a matter of public policy whether or not we should weigh in on whether or not we think victims or defendants should have a substantive right. You have made it clear that for 30 years other states have been doing this, so it's clear the direction you would like to see the state go. So, Mr. Anfinson, do you believe it's improper for this legislature to decide if a victim or defendant should have a substantive right in the courtroom with relationship to cameras in the courtroom, or do you believe that's solely within the discretion of the court?
Mr. Chair, Representative Hilstrom, I know what you want me to say, Representative Hilstrom, but I'm not going to say it. The legislature has absolutely no right to get involved in this issue. How's that? No, that's not my position at all. Of course the legislature should have concern about this issue. My response to that question is that there's no imaginable, empirically justifiable reason for the legislature to enter this topic now. The Supreme Court has already done it. You talked about the Supreme Court's slow creep on this issue. I think that exaggerates the speed with which they're proceeding. I have been very frustrated with the court, to be candid with you. I think they should move faster and further with allowing members of the public to see what happens in criminal courtrooms. But they haven't. And the singular, overwhelming, emphatic concern of the court for 10 years has been protecting victims and witnesses. Why would anyone think they're going to suddenly change? Especially when they have a majority of Democrats on the court now. That's a shot, Representative Hilstrom.
Representative Hilstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Anfinson, if this were reversed, if the legislature was weighing in and saying absolutely every courtroom should be open to every court, every jury should be able to be videoed, every victim should be able to be videoed, every defendant, would you be supporting that proposal if we were flipping it? Would you be saying we, the legislature, should be driving to allow you to be in the courtroom more?
Mr. Anfinson?
Mr. Chair, Representative Hilstrom, I certainly would be. And the reason I would support it is because it would be doing a great service to your constituents so they can see what good work the courts do. People don't understand how impressive the district courts of this state normally are. And they can't see that unless they can see it on television or on websites. And so the reason I would support that flip, as you call it, Representative Hilstrom, is because, again, as I've said, in 40 states for 30 years, there has been no documented evidence of any problem for anyone, including victims and witnesses. But I respect especially the victim testimony, and I don't personally have the slightest problem with placing restrictions on placing them on camera. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen with the court. It hasn't happened in 10 years. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. And the other concern here, Representative Hilstrom, is we're not just talking about limiting camera coverage of a victim. This amendment that has been placed on the bill this morning demolishes any real prospect of camera coverage of criminal proceedings. That's a disservice to the residents of the state.
Representative Hilstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this will just be my final comment. So your testimony was that the legislature shouldn't weigh into this policy. But what your testimony should have been is the legislature shouldn't weigh in unless you want to expand the cameras into the courtroom, because that is what you just said. And so I believe that is the role of the legislature to make a determination on whether or not we believe that victims and defendants have substantive rights with regard to this issue. Whether you agree with how far it should go or how far it shouldn't, it is the role of the legislature to decide what rights people have. And I'm just going to stop there.
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first, I just want to say that this isn't a joke. What happens in a criminal proceeding is a very serious thing for the parties directly involved. And I understand that it can be entertaining or interesting to people. But ultimately, I think that our justice system should be focused on achieving justice. And I think that your testimony particularly is a prime example of how people act differently when they're performing for the public or believe that the public is watching. And so I think that, you keep saying that nobody has a problem with it, and that you respect the testimony of the prior testifiers. But those things, that doesn't even make sense. If you truly respect the testimony of the prior testifiers, then you would give their testimony credence. And you don't speak for the advocacy community, and they've spoken well for themselves, and I think that we should all listen to what they're saying about the effects. And so if nobody has a problem with it, which is what you're saying, that nobody has any problem with the cameras in the courtroom, then why not allow the people directly involved to decide whether they want the cameras in the courtroom? Because apparently nobody has a problem with it. So if nobody has a problem with it, then we may as well let the people directly affected share their opinion about whether they have a problem or not. So I think, it's disingenuous to state that nobody has a problem with it, and it's disingenuous to undermine the testimony that we just heard from the advocacy community.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Anfinson?
Representative, you mischaracterized my testimony. You do so in a fairly fundamental way. I never said nobody cares. What I said was there are no facts that have been acquired in 30 years of extensive camera coverage in this country showing any of the impacts, in fact, have happened that the proponents of the bill describe. I care deeply about the victims. I have spent hours and hours and hours over the last several years in promoting camera coverage through the Supreme Court and talking to victims advocates who have convinced me this is a big issue, and I respect it deeply. And it's not my testimony as you've described it. This is a big concern. But when you talk about why shouldn't the people affected be allowed to decide, who is affected when there's a serial rapist at loose in the community? Who is affected when there are murderers killing children in the community? Is that just the victim? Is that just the witness? Or is it the community itself who's affected? And when you see a person who commits a terrible crime like that brought before a court, brought before a district court judge, and sentenced to life in prison, that provides an enormous community benefit. Those are the people affected. It's a huge catharsis. It's reassurance that our justice system works. It's a demonstration that we live in a society that gets people like that and puts them away. That's the benefit of the camera.
Representative Frankie. Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to clarify, you previously stated that nobody has a problem with it. I never said that you said you didn't care.
I didn't say no one has a problem with it.
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the committee, we talked through the chair. I know.
I understand the protocol.
Mr.
I also
Anfinson, let's,
understand we're supposed to properly summarize the testimony of a witness.
Mr. Anfinson, you will speak through the chair. You will speak when you're asked to.
I appreciate that.
Representative Becker-Finn has the floor at this time. She will start talking. When she is done, I will let you have a chance to respond.
Mr. Chair, I apologize to you and the committee.
Thank you,
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To be clear, court hearings are, for the most part, public already. Many of the people here in this room and here at these tables have been present at court hearings. We certainly know who the criminals in our community are. When I'm not in this building, I spend my days in the Hennepin County Government Center, and it's we've all seen the pictures of the people leaving the courtroom. We've all seen the video of them walking across the Government Center, walking across that federal area in front of the federal courthouse. We all know who those people are. The lack of cameras in the courtroom hasn't stopped us from knowing who the criminals in our community are. We all have seen mugshots. The idea that we're somehow shielding a rapist or a murderer by not allowing a camera in a court proceeding is ridiculous. So again, we need to be focusing on justice and achieving justice for the people who are directly affected by court proceedings. And if there clearly nobody has a problem with it, then I don't see how it's a problem to let the people directly affected, members of the public, the defendant, the victim, the prosecutor, who represents the state and all of us, make that decision.
Mr. Chair.